April 1945. The war in Europe was breathing its last, but death still lingered in the air. In the southern German town of Nördlingen, the once white hospital stood scarred by shrapnel and smoke. Its corridors smelled of antiseptic and fear. Inside, German nurses moved quietly between rows of cots, tending to the broken bodies of soldiers and civilians alike. They were pale, sleepless, their uniforms threadbare, their hearts emptied by 6 years of chaos. Outside, the rumble of engines drew closer, foreign, steady, unlike the panic of retreating German convoys. The nurses froze. Through the shattered window panes came the sound of American voices. Boots on cobblestones, the metallic clatter of rifles. Then silence. Moments later, a door creaked open. In stepped American soldiers. Helmets low, weapons ready, faces wary. But instead of violence, they brought something entirely unexpected. One reached into his pack, pulling out a small glass bottle. He placed it gently on the nurse's table. Perfume. The scent spread faintly through the ward, cutting through months of rot and disinfectant. For a moment, the women didn't know how to react. After years of war, the smell of something beautiful felt unreal. It was the first scent of peace. In the spring of 1945, Germany was collapsing from within. The Reich that once boasted of a 1,000-year future was now measured in days. Allied bombers swept across the skies daily, reducing cities to dust and silence. Bridges were destroyed, train lines shattered, and the countryside was littered with the debris of retreat. What had begun as Hitler's grand conquest had turned into a continental ruin. The Wehrmacht, once feared for its precision, was retreating in chaos. Civilians fled in endless columns, pushing carts piled with children and fragments of home. The smell of burning hung over every valley. The Reich's end was not glorious, it was slow, starved, and gray. For Germany's women, especially those working in hospitals, these final months were the hardest. They were not soldiers, but they were on the front line of collapse. Hospitals had become fortresses of survival, overcrowded without power or proper supplies. Windows were blacked out, corridors turned into makeshift wards, and the sound of distant artillery never stopped. Most of the doctors were gone, drafted, killed, or missing. Nurses worked around the clock, bandaging, comforting, and watching the wounded die for want of medicine. They were taught to remain loyal, to believe in victory until the very end, but by 1945 few did. What remained was duty and exhaustion. In cities like Munich, Stuttgart, and Frankfurt, Allied air raids had destroyed not just buildings but the very rhythm of life. Women who had once worked in clinics now lived in basements, moving through streets of rubble to reach hospitals that barely functioned. Food was scarce and coal had run out by midwinter. Patients were kept warm by layers of blankets and whatever could be burned in the stoves. Yet even as Germany disintegrated, the Ministry of Propaganda ordered that morale be maintained. Posters still appeared on walls, urging nurses to serve Führer and fatherland to the final breath. Most were ignored. The war had already become a fight for survival, not ideology. In the West, the American and British armies were advancing across the Rhine. After the capture of Cologne in early March, the Ruhr industrial region was surrounded. Eisenhower's forces moved swiftly southward through Bavaria and into Württemberg. The Germans called it the Great Encirclement. Entire divisions surrendered by the tens of thousands, while local towns tried to decide whether to fight or give up. Civilians hung white sheets from their windows, a desperate plea to avoid being shelled. The psychological contrast between East and West was profound. In the East, where the Soviet advance brought reports of retribution and revenge, civilians fled in terror. Women whispered rumors of atrocities, their fear spreading faster than the front lines themselves. But in the West, something different was happening. The Americans, though stern and disciplined, brought an unexpected measure of restraint. They enforced surrender, but often treated civilians with a cautious decency that shocked those raised on years of propaganda. For many German nurses, it was the first moment they realized that the enemy was not the monster they had been told to fear. Inside the hospitals, that realization came quietly. By April, many facilities had run out of supplies. Morphine was gone, bandages were washed and reused, and the wounded lay shoulder to shoulder. In some wards, the nurses treated Allied prisoners who had been captured earlier in the war, men too injured to be moved. These moments of shared suffering blurred the lines of nationality. Pain did not wear a uniform. In Bavaria, Würzburg, and Nuremberg, American advance units often found hospitals still operating amid the ruins. Their commanders issued standing orders. Do not fire upon medical buildings, do not harm medical staff. These rules, drawn from the Geneva Conventions, were upheld more often than not. Soldiers entering German hospitals were met not with resistance but with silence. Rows of patients, exhausted nurses, and the faint sound of coughing. It was in these encounters that small gestures of humanity emerged. Cigarettes were offered, food was shared, and sometimes something entirely unexpected appeared. Luxuries carried from home or salvaged from abandoned towns. Chocolate, coffee, soap, perfume to the American soldiers was a simple thing, something they might send home to wives or sweethearts. But in a war where entire nations smelled of ash and gunpowder, perfume became a symbol of normalcy. When given to the German nurses, it was not mockery. It was recognition, an unspoken acknowledgement that they were women, human beings, not symbols of the defeated Reich. For the nurses, the gesture was bewildering. Propaganda had taught them to expect cruelty, humiliation, or worse. Instead, they were handed kindness wrapped in a scent they hadn't known for years. The American military's occupation policy was pragmatic. By early 1945, Eisenhower and his staff had decided that Germany needed to be controlled but not annihilated. Medical personnel, especially nurses, were to be retained wherever possible. They were necessary for stability, to treat civilians, Allied prisoners, and German wounded alike. In many towns, U.S. officers ordered that hospitals continue to function under German staff, now working under American supervision. The war was ending, but disease and starvation were still killing thousands. The nurses' work, therefore, became part of the Allied effort to rebuild even before the guns stopped firing. It was during this transitional period that countless quiet encounters occurred, moments that were never officially recorded but lived on in post-war recollections, memoirs, and photographs. A U.S. medic sharing his rations with a German nurse, a GI leaving a bar of soap on a windowsill, a soldier giving a bottle of French perfume to a woman who hadn't smiled in years. These moments did not erase the horror of what had come before, but they cut through it. They showed that amid the ashes, something human remained. The scent of perfume in a war hospital was surreal. The nurses had grown used to the stench of gangrene, of ether and bleach, of decay. When the fragrance spread through the air, some wept without understanding why. For the first time in years, they were reminded of life before uniformity, of dresses, dances, spring days, and love. It was not romance. It was resurrection. And this shift, this strange intersection of defeat and dignity, became one of the war's quietest turning points. Across southern Germany, as towns surrendered and American patrols entered unopposed, scenes like this repeated. Hospitals full of exhausted nurses, the enemy walking in, and no shots fired. What began as fear ended in stillness. In letters home, American soldiers wrote about it. One private from the 3rd Infantry Division noted, "The German nurses looked like ghosts. We didn't know whether to salute them or feed them, so we did both." In another report from the 12th Armored Division, an officer described the scene at a hospital near Landsberg. The women did not speak. They stood beside their patients and watched. When one of my men offered her perfume, she touched it to her wrist and cried. Such accounts reveal the strange poetry of war's end, not triumph, but exhaustion meeting compassion. For the nurses who had lived through 6 years of indoctrination, the realization was almost spiritual. They had been taught that surrender meant degradation, that Americans would treat them as animals. Instead, the opposite occurred. The Americans' restraint, their small gestures of civility, carried more weight than victory parades. It was the first hint of peace that could be believed. And so in hospitals from Augsburg to Nördlingen, from Würzburg to Ulm, the war's most unexpected encounters unfolded quietly. Perfume mingled with the smell of antiseptic and smoke, and for the first time in a generation, German women saw that even after everything, the bombings, the lies, the loss, humanity had not vanished completely. That realization, fragile and unbelievable, was about to deepen, because soon, the soldiers and the nurses would meet face to face, not as enemies, but as people standing at the edge of a new world, surrounded by the ruins of the old. They had lived for years inside walls of ideology, under portraits of the Führer and the echo of orders that no one dared question. Now in the spring of 1945, all of that had turned to dust. The nurses who stood in those hospitals were not soldiers, but they had carried the weight of a nation's collapse on their shoulders. Every death, every amputation, every bombing raid, they had seen it all. And through it, they had been told one thing: the Americans were monsters. If they came, it would mean humiliation, assault, or death. So when the first American soldiers stepped through the door with calm faces and open hands, it was as if history itself had hesitated. The first angle to understand this moment is human, the quiet psychology of survival after total defeat. The nurses had spent years tending to the wounded of a lost cause, watching young boys arrive from the front with missing limbs and hollow eyes. They had endured shortages, fear, and indoctrination, often under the eyes of the Gestapo. Some had been members of the Bund Deutscher Mädel before the war, the League of German Girls, taught that obedience to the Reich was sacred duty. But now they were face to face with reality. No speeches, no banners, no orders. Just men from across the ocean who spoke a different language and didn't seem to hate them. The shock was not loud. It was internal. One nurse later described it as the silence of disbelief, the moment when the world you were told about and the world you saw stopped being the same. The second angle is moral. These women had lived under a regime that had destroyed millions of lives. Many of them had treated German soldiers who had participated in atrocities, and they knew, even if unspoken, that the nation's crimes were being repaid. The Allied bombings had flattened cities, yet, when the Americans arrived, they didn't take revenge. Instead, they disarmed the guards, secured the hospital, and started unloading supplies. Chocolate, canned meat, soap, and strangely enough, perfume. The perfume was not official. Most soldiers had brought it as gifts from home or picked it up in France. Yet its symbolism was enormous. It represented civility, something that had been wiped from German life. In that moment, the women understood something that propaganda had hidden. Mercy still existed. It was disorienting. They had expected conquest. Instead, they were met with compassion. Some later said it felt like standing in front of a mirror and realizing for the first time that they were human again. The third angle is cultural. To understand why perfume mattered, one has to understand what had been lost. During the Nazi years, femininity was redefined. Women were glorified as mothers of the nation, symbols of purity and obedience. Makeup, jewelry, or perfume were discouraged for those serving the state or the army. The war deepened this austerity. By 1944, perfume had vanished completely from shelves. Soap itself was a luxury. Most women used coal dust and vinegar as substitutes for hygiene. The idea of smelling pleasant was almost absurd in a world that stank of smoke and decay. When the Americans handed out perfume, often small bottles from Paris or New York, it was more than a gesture of kindness. It was a return of identity. For years, these nurses had been defined by their duty, their uniform, their exhaustion. That single scent reminded them of a world before war, of laughter, youth, and softness. One of them later wrote in her diary, "I had forgotten what beauty smelled like. When I opened that bottle, it was as if I remembered being alive." Another angle was psychological, the collapse of fear. Many nurses admitted that they had expected to be treated as the enemy, perhaps even executed. Some had hidden their Red Cross armbands, believing the symbol would no longer protect them. Yet when the Americans arrived, they treated them with formal respect. "Nurse," they would say, gesturing politely. They helped lift patients, carried water, even assisted in moving the wounded to cleaner rooms. One account from Stuttgart tells of an American medic who spent 2 days helping German nurses disinfect an entire hospital wing. When asked why, he simply said, "Because that's what we do." This moral contrast spread quickly through the occupied towns. Civilians began whispering that the Americans were not like the Russians, that they shared cigarettes and medicine instead of terror. The effect on morale was profound. The nurses, who had braced themselves for brutality, found themselves instead facing kindness that felt impossible to process. They had lived too long in a system built on fear to understand generosity immediately. One described it as a shock more powerful than bombing. The fifth angle is symbolic, perfume as the scent of reconciliation. In a world divided by rubble and guilt, this moment was not political but human. The perfume didn't erase the horrors of war, but it pierced through them for an instant. It was the smell of something that could exist again: trust, beauty, dignity. For the Americans, it was an unconscious act. For the Germans, it was transformative. There are photographs from this period showing American soldiers standing beside German nurses outside field hospitals, both sides smiling awkwardly. Behind them, the world was still on fire, yet those smiles were genuine. In one such photo, taken near Augsburg, a nurse clutches a small bottle to her chest, her face half in shadow, her eyes wide, not with fear, but disbelief. The caption, added later by a war correspondent, read, "Perfume after years of ashes." The sixth angle is political. The beginning of a new narrative for German women. After the fall of the Reich, the nurses became the first witnesses of the American occupation's tone. Control without cruelty, order without revenge. Their stories spread quickly. By the time Germany officially surrendered in May 1945, the fear of mass reprisals in the western zones had eased. The nurses' accounts of fair treatment helped calm entire towns. They became, unknowingly, messengers of a new kind of peace, one built not on victory speeches but on simple decency. There was also a technological angle hidden beneath this human story. The American military machine that had brought destruction also brought abundance. Supply convoys carried not just weapons but food, cigarettes, medical kits, and the small luxuries of civilian life. Soldiers received Red Cross packages filled with toiletries, soap, and yes, perfume. These were reminders of home meant to sustain morale. When shared with civilians, they bridged a gap that politics could not. The same army that had flattened German factories was now handing out bars of soap made in Detroit and perfume bottled in Paris. It was a paradox, but one that defined the post-war transformation of Germany. Then, there is the emotional angle, perhaps the most haunting of all. Many of these nurses were in their early 20s. They had grown up under dictatorship, known nothing but war, and suddenly found themselves standing in the presence of their conquerors, being treated gently. The cognitive dissonance was immense. In memoirs published decades later, several of them described the moment in similar words. "It was the first time I felt like a woman again." That statement carried layers of meaning, not vanity, but humanity reclaimed. They had been witnesses to destruction so complete that tenderness felt like a miracle. In psychological reports written after the war, Allied officers noted the unusual cooperation of German medical personnel. Many nurses volunteered to assist in caring for displaced persons, wounded Allied soldiers and civilians caught in the crossfire. They became the connective tissue between conqueror and conquered, between guilt and survival. The perfume, trivial as it seemed, had become a symbol of trust. The seventh and final angle was philosophical, what it meant for civilization itself. After years of hatred, indoctrination, and total war, the act of one soldier giving perfume to a nurse proved something simple but profound. Humanity does not vanish, even in ruins. It can be buried, suppressed, or manipulated, but it does not die. In that hospital, surrounded by the broken machinery of empire, the smallest gesture of kindness became the most powerful. And so, through the haze of smoke and the echo of artillery in the distance, these women stood still, holding bottles of perfume that smelled faintly of another world. They didn't know yet that their nation would soon surrender. They didn't know that the world would divide into East and West, or that the scars of the war would last generations. All they knew in that fleeting moment was that the scent in the air was not antiseptic or decay. It was something soft, foreign, and impossibly human. That moment, the crossing of fear into grace, was the true beginning of Germany's end and Europe's renewal. And it set the stage for what came next. The first meeting between conqueror and conquered that would redefine the meaning of victory. April 28, 1945. The morning light over southern Germany was pale and cold, filtered through a haze of dust that never seemed to settle anymore. The war was ending, but no one inside the hospital knew exactly when or how. The air was heavy with the sound of distant artillery, dull, rhythmic like a heartbeat counting down to something inevitable. In the main corridor of the small provincial hospital near Augsburg, a few nurses still moved quietly between the beds. Their white uniforms had long since turned gray. Bandages were scarce. The wounded were everywhere. Wehrmacht soldiers, old men from the Volkssturm, even civilians from the last air raid. The nurses kept working, not out of hope, but out of habit. Then came a sound none of them recognized. deep, mechanical, methodical, the rumble of American engines. It rolled through the valley like a storm. The nurses froze. Outside, a child shouted that the Americans were coming. A few of the wounded tried to sit up. Someone whispered that they would shoot everyone. Another said they would bring food. But no one really knew. Moments later, the gates creaked open. The first American jeep appeared, followed by trucks marked with white stars. Dust swirled in the air. The nurses stepped back from the windows as soldiers climbed down, rifles slung low, movements cautious, scanning for snipers. There was no gunfire, only silence and the distant caw of crows. A German officer limped out of the doorway with a white sheet tied to a broomstick. He said a few words, then surrendered his pistol. The war, at least in that town, was over. Inside the hospital, the Americans moved carefully. They had been warned to expect ambushes, booby traps, even feigned surrenders. But here they found only the wounded, and women in worn uniforms standing quietly among them. For a few tense minutes, the two sides just stared at each other. The nurses did not speak English. The soldiers spoke little German. The silence was unbearable. Then one of the soldiers, a young medic from Ohio, stepped forward and offered a cigarette to the nearest nurse. She hesitated, then took it. That single exchange broke the tension that propaganda had built for years. The Americans quickly realized what they were seeing, a hospital still functioning despite collapse. They set down their weapons, began unloading supplies, food, medical kits, tins of milk powder, boxes of morphine. The nurses, still cautious, watched as these men, once the enemy, moved with discipline and calm. One GI noticed a small child crying in the hallway, handed him a piece of chocolate from his ration pack. The boy froze, then took it. The room softened. The war had not yet officially ended, but for everyone there, something fundamental had changed. Then came the moment no one would forget. From the back of one of the trucks, an American soldier retrieved a small wooden crate. He opened it, revealing bottles, glass, delicate, glinting faintly in the dim light. Perfume. French from a captured depot, meant for shipment home. He picked one up, turned it in his hand, and looked at the nurse beside him. She stood rigid, unsure of what to do. The soldier smiled faintly and extended the bottle. She didn't move. Then, after a long pause, she reached out, her fingers trembling. When she uncapped it, a faint floral scent filled the corridor, a note of something impossibly distant from the ruin around them. It mingled with the smell of antiseptic and dust, forming something surreal. The wounded stopped whispering. A nurse near the window covered her mouth. Another began to cry silently. They had forgotten what anything beautiful could smell like. For years their world had reeked of fire, sweat, and fear. The perfume was alien, a ghost from a time before all of this. Later, one of the American medics would write in his diary, "We brought them perfume, and they cried." I didn't understand at first. Then I realized they hadn't smelled peace in 6 years. As the day went on, the Americans helped organize the wards. They shared coffee and rations with the nurses. They burned piles of old Nazi paperwork in the courtyard, insignias, orders, and photographs curling into ash. The nurses watched in silence, the smoke rising through the ruined roof. For the first time, they felt the weight of a world disappearing before their eyes. The Reich, the uniforms, the endless orders, all of it gone, reduced to gray dust, and amid that smoke drifted the strange scent of perfume, fragile but defiant. In another town near Würzburg, a similar scene unfolded. A convoy from the 12th Armored Division entered a field hospital that had survived weeks of shelling. Inside, they found nurses still tending to patients despite having no anesthesia, no proper bandages, and almost no food. Their leader, Lieutenant Henry Jacobs, described the scene. They were ghosts. We brought in supplies and they just stared. I think they thought we were there to punish them. When one of my men handed a girl a bottle of Chanel No. 5, she smiled like she'd forgotten how. These encounters were not isolated. Across Germany in April and May 1945, similar moments took place. Acts of compassion that defied every narrative of vengeance. The Americans, hardened by battle but weary of killing, found themselves caring for their former enemies. The nurses, once instruments of a fallen empire, rediscovered gentleness through the simplest gestures. In many cases, they worked side by side with American medics treating both German and Allied wounded. The lines between victor and vanquished blurred into something deeply human. There were, of course, moments of suspicion. Not all soldiers were gentle. and not every encounter was kind. But the overall pattern was undeniable. Civility had returned to the battlefield. The act of giving perfume, trivial on the surface, became symbolic of that return. It was the opposite of conquest. It was restoration. The scent meant, the killing is over. The world is beginning again. That evening, as dusk fell over the hospital, the nurses gathered outside. The town was quiet, the horizon still glowing faintly from distant fires. One of the nurses dabbed a drop of perfume onto her wrist and passed the bottle around. Each woman took her turn, touching it to her neck or sleeve, then closing her eyes. They stood there surrounded by rubble, smelling of something other than death for the first time in years. An American photographer snapped a picture, 6 women in torn uniforms, their faces gaunt but serene, standing beneath the tattered Red Cross flag. Behind them, the ruins of the hospital. In one nurse's hand, a tiny glass bottle. The photograph would later appear in a U.S. military magazine with the caption, "Peace smells like this." For the nurses, that moment marked a profound turning point. They had spent years fearing an enemy they had never met. Now they were learning that mercy could come from the same hands that had dropped bombs. The realization was painful and liberating all at once. One wrote later, "We saw the truth that day. The war was not just lost, it was over, and we were alive." In the following days, American medics worked alongside the nurses to treat remaining patients. They cleared debris, repaired generators, and shared their supplies. At night, they slept in the hospital courtyard, guarding the building from looters. There was no celebration, no speeches, only exhaustion and quiet cooperation. When Germany officially surrendered on May 8, 1945, the nurses heard the news not from a radio, but from an American sergeant who simply said, "It's done." The women didn't cheer. They stood in silence. Some wept, others stared blankly at the floor. They were too tired to rejoice, too aware of what had been lost. But in the days that followed, a kind of calm spread. The Americans began distributing food to civilians. Children wandered into the hospital to beg for candy, and soldiers obliged. The fear that had defined German life for a decade began to lift little by little, and through it all the perfume lingered. Its scent clung to the nurses' sleeves, to their hair, to the air of the wards. It mixed with the smell of medicine and dust, forming something both foreign and familiar, the aroma of normal life returning. For the Americans, it was a small act soon forgotten. For the German nurses, it became a memory they would carry for the rest of their lives. Years later, one of them, then an old woman, told a journalist, "When I think of the day the Americans came, I don't remember fear. I remember the smell of that perfume. It was the day I knew I would live." That was the turning point. Not the surrender signed in rams, not the raising of flags over ruined cities, but the quiet moment when enemies met as human beings again. The day when mercy replaced hatred and the war for a few precious seconds truly ended. The days that followed were unlike anything Germany had ever experienced. Silence, and not the silence of fear, but the hollow quiet that comes after a storm, hung over everything. The Reich had fallen. Hitler was dead, and with him, the world that had swallowed an entire generation. The American soldiers who once approached the hospital with caution now moved freely through the town, helping to restore order, feeding civilians, and tending to the wounded. For the first time in years, the horizon did not echo with artillery. Instead, it carried the distant hum of trucks and the low voices of men rebuilding what they had once destroyed. Inside the hospital, life began to take on rhythm again, though everything had changed. The nurses continued their work, but now the patients included not only German soldiers but civilians, displaced persons, even Allied prisoners who had survived captivity. The Americans insisted that all wounded be treated equally. For the nurses, this was almost unthinkable. Years of propaganda had drilled hierarchy into their minds. The Aryan first, the rest below. But now, under American supervision, the wounded were simply human. That shift was slow but profound. In treating all men alike, the nurses began to heal something larger than bodies, and they were, unknowingly, helping to mend a nation's moral wound. Many of the Americans who stayed in the hospital had come from different worlds, factory towns, farms and cities across the United States. To them, these German nurses were no longer the enemy. They were young women working themselves to exhaustion, just as the medics had done in Italy and France. They joked in broken German and English, shared rations, traded small gifts, cigarettes for bandages, coffee for a clean towel, perfume bottles for smiles. The war had created unlikely bonds, and in those bonds grew the first fragile sense of normalcy. In one report written by a U.S. Army medical officer stationed near Ulm, he described how the German hospital staff functioned under supervision with admirable order. The nurses, many of them undernourished and pale, worked without rest. When given food and supplies, they insisted on serving the patients first. He noted with quiet admiration that some of these women were the most disciplined and selfless I had ever seen. For the Germans, these words were almost inconceivable. They had been told the Allies would despise them, strip them of dignity, and punish them for their nation's crimes. Instead, they found themselves being respected for the very thing they had always believed in: their work, their care, their professionalism. It did not erase guilt, but it allowed redemption to begin. In the weeks after surrender, the hospitals became sanctuaries of transition. The world outside was chaos. Cities flattened, refugees flooding roads, the black market thriving amid ruins. But within the white walls of the wards, something resembling peace took root. The Americans continued to distribute rations: canned fruit, powdered eggs, cigarettes, soap, and occasionally those same bottles of perfume that had begun it all. For the nurses, the scent became more than a curiosity, and it became a kind of symbol. Each time they dabbed a drop behind the ear or on a sleeve, it reminded them that beauty could exist again, that life could still be fragrant even among ashes. Yet beneath the quiet cooperation was an undercurrent of reckoning. As news spread of the concentration camps, Dachau, Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen, the nurses heard, often for the first time, the full extent of what their country had done. Many refused to believe it at first. Others wept in silence. Some had even treated soldiers who had served in those places, never knowing what they had participated in. The American officers did not force them to speak about it. Instead, they let the facts arrive like slow thunder, through photographs, film reels, and the haunted eyes of survivors brought in for care. One nurse later recalled, "We thought we had seen suffering. Then the Americans brought the camp survivors. We understood that our pain was not the same. It was a different kind of wound, moral, not physical." That realization marked the beginning of another kind of healing, one that could not be achieved through medicine. The occupation authorities soon began restructuring the medical system. Former Nazi doctors were removed, and new regulations were introduced. But the nurses, most of whom had been too young or too powerless to resist orders, were allowed to stay. Their experience was invaluable. Hospitals in cities like Stuttgart, Munich, and Augsburg became the backbone of reconstruction. American medical teams worked alongside German staff, sharing techniques, modern supplies, and a sense of order. Together, they fought epidemics of typhus, tuberculosis, and malnutrition that swept across the devastated country. For many of the American soldiers, these months left a deep impression. Letters sent home reveal the quiet compassion that grew from proximity. One GI wrote to his sister, "The nurses here still wear the same old uniforms, but they smile now. They've started humming when they work. It's strange, and after all the killing, this feels like the first real peace I've seen." Some relationships went beyond camaraderie. A few soldiers formed friendships and even romances with German nurses. Though officially discouraged, these connections were difficult to prevent. In a world stripped of ideology and certainty, small acts of affection became lifelines. A soldier leaving for home might give a nurse his watch or a bottle of perfume as a farewell. A nurse might slip a thank you note into a supply crate. These gestures were quiet, unrecorded, but they spoke volumes. They were the first fragile steps toward reconciliation between two nations that had tried to destroy one another. In the broader picture, the American occupation was reshaping Germany from the ground up. While in the East the Soviets imposed vengeance and control, in the West the Americans sought reform and reconstruction. Hospitals became symbols of that difference, places where the ideology of destruction gave way to the logic of care. The nurses, once instruments of a militarized state, became early agents of humanitarian recovery. Their transformation mirrored that of the country itself. By the summer of 1945, new shipments arrived, Red Cross packages filled with essentials, medical textbooks, and even small luxuries. Among them were cases of toiletries and fragrances. One nurse in Stuttgart later recalled that when she opened a box and found a crate of French perfume, she started laughing uncontrollably. It was absurd, she said. We had no beds, no fuel, no proper food. But we had perfume. It was the world's way of telling us that life would smell sweet again one day. And slowly it did. As towns were cleared of rubble, flowers began to grow again in the cracks between stones. The nurses planted them outside the hospital windows, wild daisies salvaged from the roadside. The air filled with a mix of medicine, soil, and faint floral notes. The same women who had once lived in fear of Allied invasion now waved to American soldiers as they passed by. They learned English words for supplies, for greetings, even for jokes. But perhaps the most remarkable change was internal. The nurses who had spent years working for a collapsing regime now worked for something else entirely: humanity. Their sense of duty remained, but it was purified, detached from ideology. They understood, perhaps better than anyone, what it meant to lose one's moral compass. In rebuilding their hospitals, they were rebuilding themselves. Years later, in interviews and memoirs, many of them would look back on that time not only as the end of the war, but as the rebirth of their humanity. They spoke less about battles and more about gestures, about the chocolate, the cigarettes, and the perfume that had marked the moment when the war truly ended in their hearts. One of them, interviewed in the 1970s, said, "We were no longer enemies after that. We were people again." The aftermath of that meeting between American soldiers and German nurses was larger than the scene itself. It symbolized the first flicker of the post-war order, a Europe rebuilt not just with bricks and steel, but with decency. The scent of perfume in those hospitals became part of that legacy, remembered long after the ruins were cleared away. In the decades that followed, as Germany rose from destruction, many of those same nurses helped build the foundation of a new healthcare system. They became teachers, administrators, midwives, symbols of a nation determined to heal rather than harm. And though few ever saw the American soldiers again, the memory of that day, the quiet entrance, the kindness, the perfume, remained vivid. It became a story told in whispers, passed down like a family heirloom, proof that even in the ashes of defeat, grace could still exist. For them, peace did not begin with flags or treaties. It began in a hospital ward with a small bottle of perfume and a gesture that said more than any speech could. And in that scent, fragile, fleeting, unforgettable, the soul of post-war humanity was reborn. In the end, the war did not end with explosions or speeches for them. It ended with a scent, faint, foreign, and impossible to forget. That moment, when a bottle of perfume passed from the hands of an American soldier to a German nurse, carried the quiet truth of humanity rediscovered. It was not about politics, not about victory or defeat. It was about decency surviving in the ruins. For those women, the perfume became more than a memory. It was a symbol of survival. Every time they caught its fragrance, they remembered that kindness had crossed the threshold before vengeance. In a world that had taught them only fear, a single gesture proved that compassion could still exist even when civilization had collapsed. It did not erase guilt, but it gave them something to live for, the knowledge that even the enemy could be merciful. When historians later studied the occupation, they often wrote about treaties, trials, and reconstruction, but they rarely mentioned the small human moments that made peace possible: a cigarette, a shared meal, a smile, a bottle of perfume. Yet it was precisely those details that rebuilt the moral foundation of Europe. The scent of that perfume lingered far longer than the smoke of war. Years later, some of those nurses kept the empty bottles tucked away in drawers or on shelves, not as relics of romance, but as proof of something greater. That gentleness had survived. That war, for all its destruction, could not kill the instinct to care. The scent faded over time, but the memory did not. It remained in the air of the rebuilt hospitals, in the way the nurses trained their students, in the way they spoke of compassion as the only antidote to cruelty. And so, in the ashes of the Reich, amid the silence of surrender, the true meaning of victory revealed itself, not in conquest, but in mercy, because sometimes peace does not announce itself with trumpets. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in the fragrance of a single bottle of perfume offered in the ruins of war.